Thank you very much, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to actually talk about what's happening in marketing globally at the moment and how it connects with the super exciting changes and strategy that I know Richard is going to talk to you about a little later on. What I thought I would do is just really set the table for what's happening out there in marketing. Even though I was an operator at PepsiCo, running the global beverage group for 7 years, I described myself as an operator with a marketer's heart. My hip pocket strength is marketing, and as Richard said, I spent a lot of time, and that's also my personal passion. And following where the industry is today is more exciting and dynamic than it has ever been. I describe marketing today as one of the most exciting disciplines to be in and one of the most treacherous. It's exciting because every day, because of the pace of change, you're learning so much. You're upskilling all the time. As a CMO today, your calendar would look more like that of a CFO or a CTO, given the intersection points that have to happen in major companies and how marketing is connecting the dots across the C-suite in most major companies in order to drive growth. I often describe the chief marketing officer as the chief integration officer or the chief collaboration officer of most companies, because apart from probably the CHRO or maybe the CFO, the CMO now needs to work horizontally across the C-suite in order to execute the growth agenda for which they're principally now becoming increasingly accountable for. So just to kind of set the table for marketing, it's never been easier to reach people as marketers now. We have a whole bunch of technologies. We have a whole bunch of platforms beyond the traditional print, television, radio, out-of-home, direct mail that we had maybe 20 years ago. But despite the fact that it's never been easier to reach a consumer, it's also been never more difficult to connect with her. And that's because over time, our marketing efforts, unfortunately, have been perceived by consumers more as pollution than they have value add. And technologies and behaviors have emerged over time to screen out that pollution, whether they be business models like subscription-based content viewing, i.e. Netflix, or the rise of ad blockers. We have, as marketers, created the predicament that we're in right now, which is we have a reputation for being the discipline that creates content that consumers want to screen out and not seek out. And I think there's an incredible inflection point that's going to take place there. In my day, when I first started in marketing, the way you developed your marketing plan is you look backwards. You look back and you listed all of the initiatives that you did the year before and what they delivered, and then you would replicate them, all the ones obviously that worked, and kind of do that over again. It was kind of a cut and paste. You'd discard the things that didn't deliver, you'd repeat the things that did. That whole dynamic has changed now because the operating environment that we're executing in, the consumer environment, our society is moving at a pace right now where there is no guarantee that what worked last year is going to work this year. And that's kind of exciting and daunting all at the same time because it drives the much greater need to innovate. And so what I'm going to go over very briefly today, and I apologize, the slides are probably a little more wordy than the time allocated for me to present them. So I'll probably stay at a very top line. But I think there are 6 major trends that are happening in marketing today. And by the way, from an external perspective looking in, all of which I think represent huge tailwinds for the DCM business. And so I think that's very exciting given the changes that are taking place. The first thing is that marketers have always been the innovation engine of a company, but now the burden of that is even higher. We have seen business models. It used to be, in my view, businesses used to grow or decline logarithmically. Now that doesn't happen anymore. Businesses grow logarithmically for a while and then they hockey stick, but more importantly, they decline logarithmically for a while, and then they drop off a cliff. Largely as a consequence of digital disruptors entering your category. So marketers, more than any other group in the organization, have to be constantly understanding not only what their consumers want, but what the competitive environment is looking like. So innovation is really more important than it has ever been. But not innovation as we have historically known it. Innovation in big Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies has always been a long and laborious process. The consumer insights process alone took months and months and months, was incredibly expensive. Companies like Nielsen made huge amounts of money from understanding the consumer. Now, there is neither the time, the appetite, nor frankly the budget to execute a consumer understanding plan using those methodologies. Now, we understand consumer behavior in real time. We have to understand a marketing action that goes into the market, what behavior happens in that moment in time, and then optimize and refine that marketing behavior for the next effort. This isn't a process that takes months now. This is a process that needs to take seconds. And framing up how we think about getting the consumer insights that we need to drive innovation is now a completely different AI-driven, digitally driven operation now. That has given rise to a whole new skill set. In my day, it used to be that you could put any great marketer in charge of innovation. You took your hypos from marketing and you said, here, you rotate in innovation, run innovation for a while. And then you'd show up in those jobs and go, okay, I guess I just go out and hire a great innovation agency. That is neither the case nor the necessity right now, because I think what is happening is innovation has formed itself as such a deep and narrow specialty that more and more companies are hiring externally people who know how to innovate. And by innovation, I'm not just talking about new product development. They're not synonymous terms. One is a subset of the other. I'm talking about innovating your business model, innovating your communication channels, and certainly innovating your products. We used to live in a world that was tell and sell. So when I first started in this business, you used to create communication content, and you used to then pay somebody who had even better content than you, typically a television network, to overlay your content that nobody actually asked to see on top of their content, which lots of people wanted to see, at a cost. That was the kind of marketing industrial complex, if you like. And that worked for a while until consumers kind of figured out that they could skip that content that they actually didn't want to see, and they started to increasingly view that content as pollution to the content that they actually really did want to see. Hence the rise of streaming services and subscription services and ad blockers and so on and so forth. This has fundamentally shifted. We have moved in marketing from this kind of one size fits many. I produce a piece of content, I throw it out there, I get a lot of eyeballs, and X percentage of people take action, and I wash and repeat that process again, to much more personalized experiences based on the insights that I talked about before, where we can understand what consumer behavior is happening, and we tailor the marketing and tailor the content of our marketing specifically to that. That has given rise to an explosion in content needs, digital content needs, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail. But we now have to deliver personalization at scale, but personalization in a very meaningful way. I gave the anecdote in a talk that I just gave about, we talk about personalization and we think we're really smart as marketers, but I think we have a long way to go in really making personalization meaningful to the consumer. And I give the anecdote of over COVID, a friend of mine was looking to buy a car and she asked my help. So I was sitting in my house, she was sitting in her house, she was interested in a Mini. We were both on the Mini website. I was only on there to help her. She was on there to help to buy a car. The next day, I was overwhelmed by messaging from Mini. I'm like, what? And then it just was relentless, and it kept going and going because they had, I describe it as they had enough information about me to be creepy. They knew that I was looking on their site, But they really didn't dig any deeper to figure out why I might be there. And had they dug deeper, they would have figured out that I recently just bought a car. I've never bought a car of that size in my entire car buying history. I've only ever driven SUVs. So it would be very, very unlikely that I was on that site to buy a Mini. But they started communicating me, and overwhelmingly communicating with me in emails, in every time I went onto Facebook, I suddenly had a Mini popping up on my page. Directionally, that's where marketing is going, understanding my behavior and delivering me appropriate content. But we have a long, long, long way to go to make sure that we truly understand and interpret the behaviors that we're seeing digitally in the right context and from the consumer's perspective. This term has arisen, which I can't believe I'm using in a presentation because I personally dislike it, called performance marketing. It's a whole segment of marketing. I'm yet to find the marketer who says, no, I don't want to work in the performance marketing group. I want to work in the group that creates the marketing that doesn't perform. But nonetheless, there is this group called performance-based marketing. And essentially, I know I'm going to date myself here, but it's no more detailed than what we thought about back in the day where direct mail was a channel, except it's executed in digital and we have a lot more data about the consumer. So this is driving to this relationship and communication with the consumer at a highly personalized level where we understand, or we think we understand, what they're looking for, and we tailor messages to that. That means that the skill sets in the marketing department are profoundly different than what they historically have been, which marketing was typically populated by creative business people, for want of a better term. Now, coming into marketing, you have people with analytics capabilities, people with technology abilities, and people with creative capabilities because of all the content and the analytics around that content that need to get developed. This has, I talk about let's take a brand like Pepsi, for example. 10 years ago, if you were the marketing manager on Pepsi, you probably had to produce 5 pieces of content a year. They were typically television commercials. You had about a 6-month development cycle for those 5 pieces of content. And the unit cost of those pieces of content was between $1 and $2 million. If it was a Super Bowl commercial, it would probably be higher. Now, 5 pieces of content is more like 500,000 pieces of content per year for a brand like Pepsi. And by the way, by content, I'm referring to social media posts. I'm referring to video on social media and so on. So 5 has become 500,000. 6 months has become 6 seconds. And $1 million per unit has become $1, a cent. And so it has profoundly reshaped how we think about content as marketers. It has led to an explosion in content, and it has led to explosion in complexity around that content. And so as we think about kind of what marketers are looking for right now, it's how do I manage all this content that I have to publish in an efficient and effective way, and how do I significantly reduce the complexity? Because I think the story, hopefully, the story that I will leave you with after we go through these is the operating environment and the world of the marketer is exponentially more complex than it has ever been before. And companies that can come along and offer me solutions to reduce that complexity are the first companies that you take a meeting from, or at least I did when I was running Pepsi. So again, we also see shifting, the other big trend is this shifting roles within the value chain. It used to be, again, I will use Pepsi as an example. Pepsi used to have 4 or 5 agencies. You had a creative agency, you had a media agency, you had a design agency, you might have another backup advertising creative agency. Now, brand Pepsi would probably have 60, 70 agencies by the time you add in content partner. And by the way, they're not agencies as we would historically have categorized them. They're more like content partners. But they're social media people. They're people who specialize in analytics. They're people who specialize in producing personalized content at scale that I talked about before. That complexity of just managing the partner roster has been an explosive and daunting challenge for marketers to manage. And that has actually led to the phenomena of insourcing. Because if I have a very complex external partnership model, why not just insource it, where I have greater control over the capabilities that I bring in? I can manage it better than I can if it was externally. And we are seeing a mass movement, I would say at this point, into insourcing what has historically been outsourced, particularly around content. Most major brands have either implemented or are in discussion about implementing some form of in-housing of content, mainly digital content, although television is more and more coming inside as well. Again, huge opportunity. You think about all these assets, digital assets that are getting created. How do they get managed? How do you make sure that you're not replicating the same thing over and over again when there could be something in your vast library of content that you can repurpose, retool, and redeploy? So this is becoming a major movement in marketing, and the whole value chain has been disrupted here. One of the biggest changes that I've seen over the last 5 years is this movement toward purpose. It used to be that consumers were kind of interested they were fascinated when you said you worked at PepsiCo, and they would say, oh, wow, I didn't realize you made Quaker Oats, or I didn't realize you made Tropicana, or I didn't realize that you had Frito-Lay. Consumers are a lot less interested now in what a company makes and a whole lot more interested in what makes the company. Meaning, it used to be that a company like PepsiCo or Unilever or Procter & Gamble or any company, consumers were just they didn't want to do business with you if you were having a net negative effect on society. Now, that has moved on. They expect the brands that they do business with to have a net positive impact on society. And that can come in many shapes or forms, whether it be DE&I, whether it be fair trade, whether it be environmental sustainability. The data that's available to consumers today to understand the behavior and societal impact of the brands that they do business with is more accessible and vast than it has ever been. And consumers are more and more making the choice of the environment as one key driver in their decision making. This is the rise of plant-based meats as an example, as a category. People are eating plant-based meats not because they taste better than meat, not because they're less processed than meat, not because they're better for you than meat, but because there's a perceived environmental benefit of eating something that doesn't create the greenhouse gas emissions. That's a whole category that's being driven by impact on the environment. We are seeing the rise of the conscious consumer now, and if you're a brand that doesn't have a robust ESG strategy and you're publishing vast amounts of content around that, then you're in a lot of trouble. And I think, unfortunately, this continues to be an area that lots of people talk about, not a lot of people execute on. I was cautious about including it in this presentation because I hate it when purpose and ESG is relegated to the marketing folks. That's a big warning signal because that just tells you that companies want to talk more about it than actually embed it into their business model and their business operations. And when I was at PepsiCo, Indra Nooyi, who I had the good fortune to work for there, and was one of the very early architects of a business that oriented itself around purpose, we used to make the distinction between CSR, corporate responsibility, and purpose. Corporate responsibility is how you spend the money. You make a whole bunch of money, and then you hand it off to the CSR people, and they spend it on some charitable things, and people think you're nice guys, and you keep going on doing bad things. Now, purpose is more about how you make the money. How is purpose embedded into your actual operating model? Are you having a net positive impact on society as a consequence of your business operations? Not how much money you're giving away to charities. That's ESG. Still important, but very, very different than, it's CSR. Very, very different than ESG. The next is the rise of diversity. I mean, we have talked about diversity in marketing and in business now for a long, long time. Finally, we're making progress on the visible signs of diversity, gender and race in particular. But in marketing now, there is a much greater drive for intellectual diversity. And what I mean by that is it used to be that there were kind of very predictable and reliable talent sources that you could go after when marketing was somewhat of a homogenous group of people. But now marketers have to be great at the creative side, great at the growth side, great at the analytics side, great at the tech side. And so you're getting a very diverse marketing set here. And again, adding to the complexity, managing that kind of diverse group of people, figuring out their compensation strategies, figuring out how to motivate them as a leader, figuring out how to progress them through the company, all adds to the complexity that marketers have today. But on the upside, marketing is a much more dynamic area to be in today because you have to upskill feels like every month. I was joking this morning, just when marketers figured out that they had their social media figured out, like I'm feeling pretty good about my social media. I've got Instagram nailed, I've got Facebook nailed, I'm communicating with my consumers. Now this metaverse, NFTs have cropped up. And I saw an article this morning, the 16 best CMOs that have mastered NFTs. I'm like, NFTs? It's taken me this long to figure out what the acronym stood for, let alone what it is. And now we have 16 CMOs who've mastered NFTs. This is the pace and the expectation that marketing is moving at, how it's becoming digital. All of these things connect to an exponential growth and explosion in the need for greater content and different types of content. But most of all of it is adding to this incredible complexity for the CMO in terms of executing her role, which is the slide I kind of want to leave you with. As I said earlier, when there were many people, when you're a marketer at a big company with visible brands, lots of people want to meet with you all the time. And most of them you don't meet with. But anybody who can promise you a reduction in complexity, particularly as it relates to all of your kind of digital assets and media partners and content partners, they're the ones that rise to the list in terms of the people you want to meet with, because it's hard being a CMO. Most CMOs are kind of roughly in my age bracket. We didn't grow up in the world of NFTs and the metaverse. We didn't even really grow up in the world of having digital. We've had to learn this every single step of the way. There is huge insecurity amongst major marketers that they haven't figured this out. There's huge FOMO around missing out on the next big thing. I'm sure there are thousands of CMOs around the country after the article this morning going, well, I don't have an NFT strategy. What's an NFT strategy? I'm calling up their next in line. Let's have a meeting about what's our NFT strategy. I guarantee you that's happening all around the country today, because everything is moving at such an incredible pace. Everything is digitizing at a rate that is overwhelming, quite frankly, and the complexity of the role of marketing today has never been greater than it is. So I'll leave you with that thought. I think I'm going to pass over to for Jim right now, and then I think we're taking questions at the end.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much, Brad. Thanks, everyone, and thanks again, Brad and Richard. I wanted to follow up one or 2 points. As mentioned when Richard introduced me, Brad talked a lot about public companies today. I spent a lot of my time also working with private consumer companies, private investors in the consumer space. And I think two of the topics that were hit on by Brad very much are things that those folks are focused on as well. So as you think about building out companies today, you can't do anything without focusing on ESG at the moment, right? Both from a risk perspective as well as then a go-forward growth opportunity when exiting a private company. In the past 6 months, it's become an absolute blinding focus for folks, and we see that every day in our work. And I think the second is the complexity of just managing marketing elements. Actually, Zach and I, my colleague who's here with me, were on the phone with one of our clients who's the CEO of a beauty company this morning, privately invested in, who was talking about how to figure out how to use TikTok, right, as a way now to market the changing elements of marketing. And on a call 2 or 3 days before was talking about how to manage historical marketing assets to reuse, to relaunch the brand in the market, right? So this, I think that, the thing that we see every day in our work is how these are popping as themes. And so if I was stepping back, for a second, if you think of all the themes that were talked about today that Brad hit on, and you think about their applicability to DCM, which obviously Richard and team will go into much better than I will, but I think 4 of these seem to resonate very clearly, right? So the fragmentation of the media and marketing platforms that we talked about with a real twist towards digital. How do you get away from mass messaging to more personalized messaging? You have to be able to manage that through content management, through managing your assets, through thinking through how to do that. That obviously ties very clearly to what DCM is focused on. The sheer quantity of content and how to manage it and how to reuse it. The example I just gave about the beauty company that was thinking about that, that's exactly where their strategy is focused and how you do that in an efficient and effective way. The move away from if you can't have 50 to 70 agencies working with you and you're going to pull more things in-house, you need a partner to help you operationalize that. We think that's a trend that we're going to see coming quite a bit going forward, and we've seen it already. And then the ESG point, clearly a friend, right, moving towards digital marketing. The ESG element there is pretty obvious from an environmental perspective. So we just hit on those, wrap them up as kind of a few different themes that be popping from what Brad talked about to tie into the rest of the Investor Day, and thank you for having us.
Right. Thank you. So we got a few minutes for questions. If anybody's got any questions, of course, Brad and Jim will be around during reception as well. So, any questions from anybody virtually or physically in the office here? Mr. Cochran.
During our years, they were always being cut and more efficient, but you talked about, you may have had 5 agencies, you now have 60 data points and whatever.
I would say that as a percentage of net revenue, which is typically how you think about relative marketing spend, we have not seen those go significantly up, especially relative to the content required now. I mean, my example of 5 pieces of content over 6 months at a unit cost of $1 million. The absolute budget hasn't changed, but the amount of content and capabilities that now needs to encompass has exponentially increased. So I think they've remained flat, and the demands on marketing budgets have exponentially increased.
And the need to make them work harder.
Right.
Okay, any other questions? Again, Brad and Jim will be around. Jason.
Thanks, guys. Great presentation, guys. Just to focus on reducing complexity. So, how can it impact an organization's P&L? I can see it potentially impacting operating costs and SG&A, making things easier. But is it just about creating efficiencies? How can reducing complexity really help drive revenue?
Do you want to go?
I mean, I'll give one thought, and then Brad, you just jump in, because I think particularly in companies that are trying, the speed of reaction that's required from a marketing perspective these days in the market, because everything is digital and happening so quickly, that reduction in complexity and the ability to manage your assets and respond quickly, I think, is a real driver for performance. And I've seen that, the example I mentioned before, where the reaction time, right, when you're a company around either a trend or potentially even a public relations issue, I think the cycle time is faster than I've ever seen. So the ability to do that, I think, is a real competitive advantage.
Absolutely, and a potential issue around share as well. In almost every company and every category, there's a digital disruptor out there. And so all of these things that I talked about in the context of my background, which is the to from, they've never had a from. Their to is their from. They're on to the next thing. And so as we are increasingly operating in a world where consumer brands are not dominated by the big manufacturers, but digitally enabled emerging companies are the ones probably stealing the most amount of share in each category. That's where I think about these capabilities and these trends as part of the P&L dynamic.
Using the example of complexity, are you looking at ways to deal with crisis management if you now have 500,000 pieces of different content that could all be super embarrassing to you that you'd like to change overnight? Is that something that you're building in perhaps as part of your Assemble product, or your other clients are doing with that?
So it's brand risk is a major topic of conversation. You have two issues. You have the content itself, and in the highly divided society in which we're publishing content in now, where millions of people have access to communicate their points of view about your content to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people through social media, is a major point. But also media adjacency, as we're publishing all of this content. Where do we end up next to? And in the consumer's mindset, if you're in a news article that's talking about a particular thing and you're advertising right next to it, there's this implicit idea of endorsement. Facebook, YouTube, all of the platforms have had this issue of media risk. It is a giant problem. I don't think it's a problem that people have gotten their arms around yet. AI is helping exponentially, but even at Google, with YouTube, you would think, right, Google, YouTube, they must have the most complex technologies available to screen out unpleasant content. They have teams of hundreds of people, thousands of people, as does Facebook, who actually look at content, human beings viewing pieces of content, and then determining whether they represent content that's harmful for society and therefore potentially harmful for brands. So I wish I had a great answer that everybody's doing it right. I think AI is helping us more than it ever has. The thing that is impossible to implement is the old-fashioned review process internally that you went through for perhaps a television ad where you shipped it off to the legal department, they signed off on it, you shipped it off to the operations people, they signed off on it, maybe the CEO looked at it, she signed off on it. I mean, that's just impractical now. So I think it is a huge problem, and I think it's one of the problems that marketing and companies need to grapple with.
Yeah, and you'll hear a little bit more when Shelley talks about our Assemble platform. And as Brad said, just the sheer number of assets that need to be managed today and managed the compliance and governance around that. You can't do that with SharePoint in today's world, right? SharePoint doesn't work. You will definitely have non-compliant communication if you're using a SharePoint or using some type of shared drive. So you'll hear more about that when we talk about Assemble, and that's a huge value that we're delivering to clients, and quite frankly, anybody that's in the digital asset management solutioning business is delivering to clients in today's world. So.
Hi, Anya Chesnik. You've given some really good examples of Pepsi and other companies. I was just wondering, do you have any examples of recent marketing initiatives that you've done that really bombed or really were successful? Like quickly, like whether it was for Facebook or, that kind of stuff.
Well, it actually is a great connection into the last question. And I have a massive one in my career, which happened under my watch, where the marketing team in North America thought it would be a really great idea to get Kendall Jenner to film a piece of content and then hand a can of Pepsi to a policeman standing by the side of what was being portrayed as a march but was interpreted as a Black Lives Matter protest. And I found myself I was flying over the Atlantic at the time on the company plane, and suddenly the satellite phone kept going off like crazy. And by the time I landed, I got off the plane, and as I'm walking through the terminal, I looked up and there was Pepsi all over CNN and CNBC and so on and so forth. Massive fault. How did that happen? Well, it didn't happen because PepsiCo is populated with a whole bunch of racist people who didn't ever hear of Black Lives Matter. That I can assure you. It happened because the methodologies that the company was using at the time to assess the efficacy of marketing were just too blunt. we were trained as marketers. You kind of do pre-testing of marketing. You put it out there, and we were trained as marketing. You look for major trends. You look for whether the majority of people like it or the majority of people don't like it. Public opinion isn't formed by the majority anymore. Public opinion is formed by the keyboard warriors that have a particular view on a particular issue, and overnight you can become an infamous brand, as Pepsi became for almost a month. So that's an example of a really bad idea. Let me give you an example of a really good idea. And I'll use an example of ESG and how it's baked into the business agenda. Patagonia, I happen to think, is doing an amazing job as a brand. They are dealing with this, frankly, the number 1 or 2 polluter and contributor to landfill. Surprisingly, is not the beverage industry, which you would think. It's the fashion industry. This movement toward fast fashion and disposable fashion, away from kind of enduring style, has caused a massive environmental crisis, frankly.
Zara and H&M, right?
Zara, H&M, Uniqlo, go through the list. What Patagonia have done is really tackled that issue head on, and they encourage people that when you're not ready, when you don't like your clothes anymore, bring them back to us. They refurbish them and they sell them again in the store. And so there's a whole section of Patagonia where you can go to with pre-loved Patagonia. They close all of their stores on Black Friday, which is the largest retail shopping day of the United States, because they're like, if we're a brand that stands for the great outdoors, if we're a brand that stands for leisure, why would we not let our employees take that day off after Thanksgiving? These are actions. I mean, there was a very famous advertising person who once said, a principle isn't a principle until it costs you money. And when Patagonia do something like that and consumers go, wow, they closed on Black Friday, that must have cost them a lot of money. That must mean they're really serious about this. The long-term impact is significant.
One more question.
Right. The mini example that you gave. The mini example that you gave, in your personal journey, looking at a car. Is there a point where brands can become annoying? What you described to me, the first thing that jumps to mind is, wow, that almost has feels like a negative impact for many on you. How do you deal with that as a marketer?
Most brands are annoying, like vast majority of them. Think about, remember, I often say people hate advertising in general, but love advertising in particular. And what I mean by that is if I went around the room and said, name your favorite television commercial, every one of you would be able to give me one. But if I said to you, do you like the advertising as you're watching a hockey game? You'd go, hell no, get rid of it. So absolutely, why? Because as marketers, we became lazy. And we paid for the privilege of eyeballs by overlaying our content on top of content that people actually wanted to see. And as a consequence, it gave rise to ad blockers. It gave rise to non-advertising supported subscription models for content. That's all our fault. That would never have happened had we been creating advertising content that was as compelling, entertaining, engaging, uplifting, and as exciting as the content that went over it. So I would say, yes, it's a cultural issue with marketing. I would say that we have to solve for that because technology will just keep beating us out. And I'll give my last rant on this topic. It drives me nuts when you're sitting in the performance marketing meetings and people come to you and say, we ran this piece of content and it got a 3% click-through rate or a 3% response rate. Now, 3% is a giant number in marketing. People used to come to me at PepsiCo all the time and say that. My response would be, okay, that's nice. What did the 97% of other people think? And how many of them did we really annoy? And how many of them did we annoy to the point where they don't even want to consider buying us anymore because every time they go onto YouTube, they're served a piece of Mountain Dew pre-roll, even though they have no idea, they have no interest in Mountain Dew. And so I think it's a cultural move. I think brands need to think more like content companies and less like pollution companies, frankly.
Richard, we have one question online from Michael Lang. Brad, they say, great presentation. Your thoughts are spot on. However, not every industry adopts change at the same time. Which industries are likely to be attractive to DCM? Your thoughts on financial services versus metaverse?
Wow. So I think financial services in particular, it's hard for me to say there's a particular category that would be attracted to DCM. I think this idea that different categories have, for some reason, a whole pass to move more slowly on innovation, I don't necessarily see that as happening. Now, there are some oligopolistic categories that are dominated by 2 or 3 really big players who could potentially move slower than maybe categories that have multiple competitors in them. Financial services might be one of them with the rise of fintech. They may be able to move a little bit slower. But ultimately, those oligopolistically structured categories are precisely the ones that the digital disruptors have their eye on to go after. So I think that that this idea of a different pace of change by category it may exist in some places, but it's not a sustainable one.
I would add any industry that wants to grow and has regulation.
Absolutely.
Which is everyone.
Exactly.
All right. So, Brad, thank you very much.
Thank
and
you,
Jim,
everyone.
it was very insightful. Really appreciate it. Brad and Jim are around after for questions.